city girl saved from a jaguar, and finds a new beginning with a widowed lumberjack. Welcome to today's story about unexpected encounters, second chances, and the healing power of love in the untamed wilderness of the American West. You're about to witness how a dangerous moment in the forest becomes the beginning of something beautiful between two wounded souls. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dense Colorado forest as Margaret Whitmore stepped carefully along the winding trail, her leather boots crunching softly on fallen pine needles. The crisp mountain air filled her lungs, a stark contrast to the suffocating smog of Chicago that she'd left behind 3 days ago. At 26, Margaret carried herself with the refined posture of city breeding, but her green eyes held a wariness that spoke of recent heartbreak. She had come to the remote mountain town of Cedar Ridge seeking solitude and healing. The elegant Victorian boarding house where she'd taken residence stood at the edge of civilization, where the last cobblestone gave way to dirt paths and wilderness. The weight of her recent broken engagement to Thomas Caldwell, a prominent banker who had chosen his reputation over their love when her father's business collapsed, still pressed heavily on her heart. Margaret pulled her woolen shawl tighter against the morning chill as she ventured deeper into the forest. The towering pines seemed to whisper secrets of resilience, their branches swaying gently in the mountain breeze. Birds called to each other from hidden perches, and somewhere in the distance, a stream babbled over smooth stones. For the first time in months, she felt her shoulders begin to relax. Meanwhile, deeper in the forest, Sam Cooper was already at work. The rhythmic sound of his axe biting into seasoned oak echoed through the trees as he prepared timber for the approaching winter. At 34, Sam was a man carved by hardship and loss. His broad shoulders and calloused hands spoke of years spent wrestling a living from the unforgiving wilderness. His dark hair, touched with premature silver at the temples, caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy above. 3 years had passed since consumption had claimed his beloved wife, Sarah, leaving him alone in their modest log cabin, with only memories and the endless work of survival. Sam had built a wall around his heart as sturdy as the timber he cut, convincing himself that solitude was safer than the risk of loss. His only companions were the occasional travelers who purchased his lumber and the wildlife that shared his domain. As Margaret wandered further from the established trail, drawn by the melodic sound of running water, she marveled at the untamed beauty surrounding her. Wildflowers dotted the forest floor in patches of purple and yellow, and shafts of golden sunlight created a cathedral-like atmosphere among the ancient trees. The stress that had knotted her stomach for months began to ease with each step away from civilization. If you're enjoying the video so far, a like and subscribe to the channel really helps a lot. She paused beside a small clearing, where a crystal-clear stream wound its way between moss-covered rocks. Kneeling carefully to avoid soiling her navy traveling dress, Margaret cupped the cold water in her palms and splashed it on her face. The shock of the icy liquid made her gasp, but it felt like a baptism of sorts, washing away the disappointment and betrayal that had driven her west. Lost in the peaceful moment, Margaret didn't notice the subtle changes in the forest around her. The birds had grown quiet. The squirrels had stopped their chattering. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. In the distance, Sam's axe fell silent as well, though for different reasons. His experienced woodsman's instincts had detected something that made every muscle in his body tense with alertness. As Margaret rose from the stream, brushing droplets from her face, a low growl rumbled through the clearing behind her. Her blood turned to ice as she slowly turned to see a magnificent and terrifying sight: a mountain lion. Its golden coat dappled with shadows, crouched on a fallen log, not 30 feet away, the great cat's amber eyes fixed on her with predatory intensity. Its powerful muscles coiled like springs, ready to unleash devastating force. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but some deeper wisdom kept her frozen in place. The mountain lion's tail twitched with barely contained energy, and she could see the sharp white teeth as it pulled back its lips in a silent snarl. Time seemed suspended in that moment of pure terror, the civilized world she'd known feeling impossibly far away. The cat took a slow, deliberate step forward, never breaking eye contact. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized how utterly helpless she was. Her parasol, lying forgotten beside the stream, would be useless against such a formidable predator. All the etiquette lessons and social graces of her Chicago upbringing meant nothing in the face of nature's raw power. As the mountain lion shifted its weight, preparing to spring, Margaret closed her eyes and whispered a prayer to whatever force might be listening in this wild place. The sound of her own pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out even the gentle babble of the stream that had drawn her to this fateful spot. The mountain lion's muscles bunched as it prepared to leap, its amber eyes never leaving Margaret's terrified face. In that suspended moment between life and death, the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, like thunder rolling down from the peaks, a deep, commanding voice shattered the silence. "Easy there, girl." Sam Cooper stepped into the clearing with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged in this untamed place. His broad frame filled the space between Margaret and the predator, and in his weathered hands, he held his woodsman's axe with casual expertise. The mountain lion's attention immediately shifted to this new threat, recognizing in Sam something it hadn't sensed in the frightened woman. "Fellow apex predator, back away slowly," Sam murmured to Margaret without taking his eyes off the cat. His voice carried a calm authority that somehow penetrated her paralyzing fear. "Don't run. Just step backward, toward the stream." Margaret's legs felt like water, but she forced herself to obey, her boots finding purchase on the uneven ground as she retreated inch by inch. The mountain lion's gaze flicked between them, clearly calculating whether this bearded stranger posed enough of a threat to abandon its intended prey. Sam began to move sideways, creating a wider barrier between the cat and Margaret. His movements were deliberate and measured, showing no fear, but also no aggression that might provoke an attack. Years of living in harmony with the wilderness had taught him to read the language of wild things. This particular cat was young, probably a female, driven from her mother's territory, and hungry enough to consider humans as potential prey. "You're beautiful," Sam said softly to the mountain lion, his tone almost conversational. "But you're in the wrong place, looking at the wrong meal." The great cat's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Sam slowly reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a piece of dried venison, tossing it gently to the side of the clearing. The mountain lion's nostrils flared as she caught the scent, her attention momentarily diverted. "Leave a comment about what you think of this story so far." "That's it," Sam encouraged as the cat took a cautious step toward the offering. "That's much easier than tangling with us, isn't it?" Margaret watched in amazement as this stranger, this guardian angel who had appeared from nowhere with death itself. His dark hair caught the filtered sunlight, and she could see the careful intelligence in his brown eyes as he assessed every movement of the predator. There was something almost supernatural about his calm presence, as if the forest had sent one of its own to protect her. The mountain lion approached the venison cautiously, never fully turning her back on the humans. When she finally seized the meat in her powerful jaws, Sam took the opportunity to move closer to Margaret, his axe still ready, but less prominently displayed. "When she's distracted," he whispered, "we're going to back away together. Stay behind me and match my pace exactly." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. As the mountain lion focused on her unexpected meal, Sam began their careful retreat. His hand found Margaret's elbow, steadying her as they navigated the uneven ground. His touch sent an unexpected warmth through her arm, a feeling of safety she hadn't experienced since childhood. Step by step, they made their way out of the clearing. The mountain lion watched them go but made no move to follow, apparently satisfied with the trade. Only when they were well beyond the stream did Sam allow himself to relax slightly, though his senses remained alert for any sign of pursuit. "Are you hurt?" he asked, finally turning to face Margaret properly. Up close, she could see the concern etched in the lines around his eyes, the genuine worry of someone who understood how close she'd come to disaster. Margaret shook her head, though her hands trembled as she tried to smooth her disheveled skirts. "I know, I'm not hurt. Thanks to you." Her voice came out smaller than intended, shaky with the aftermath of terror and relief. Sam studied her face, taking in the pale complexion and wide green eyes that spoke of shock and city-bred unfamiliarity with wilderness dangers. Her clothes marked her as quality folk, the kind who usually traveled with guides and stayed on established roads. "What brings a lady like you out here alone?" he asked, not unkindly but with the practical concern of someone who understood the risks she'd been taking. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how far she'd strayed from safety. "I'm staying at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house in Cedar Ridge. I just wanted some fresh air, some time to think." She paused, looking back toward the clearing they'd left behind. "I had no idea it could be so dangerous." "The wilderness doesn't care about our troubles," Sam said gently. "It just is what it is. Beautiful and deadly in equal measure." As they stood there in the dappled sunlight, Something passed between them, a recognition that went deeper than their brief acquaintance. Margaret saw in this rugged stranger a strength and certainty she'd never encountered in the drawing rooms of Chicago. Sam saw in her something he'd thought lost forever, a reminder that there was more to life than mere survival. "I should walk you back to town," Sam offered, shouldering his axe. "The forest can be unpredictable, especially this time of year, when the cats are establishing new territory." Margaret nodded gratefully, though part of her was reluctant to leave this place where something extraordinary had just occurred. As they began the journey back toward civilization, she found herself stealing glances at her rescuer, wondering what circumstances had brought such a man to live alone in these remote mountains. Neither of them spoke much during the walk, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet of two people processing a shared experience that had changed something fundamental between them. The forest around them seemed different now, not just beautiful or terrifying, but alive with possibilities neither had considered before this morning. The walk back to Cedar Ridge took nearly 2 hours, winding through dense forest trails that Sam navigated with the easy confidence of long familiarity. Margaret found herself studying her rescuer as they walked, noting the way he automatically checked the wind direction, how his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, and the gentle respect with which he moved through his domain. This was a man completely at home in a world that had nearly killed her. "You know these woods well," Margaret observed as they paused at a small overlook that revealed the valley town spread below them like a child's toy village. Sam's weathered hands rested on a walking stick he'd fashioned from a fallen branch. "Been living up here about 8 years now. The forest teaches you its ways if you're willing to listen." He gestured toward the neat rows of buildings below. "Most folks down there think the wilderness is something to be conquered. They don't understand it's something to be partnered with." As they descended toward town, the contrast between their worlds became increasingly apparent. Margaret's refined Eastern dress and careful speech marked her as clearly as if she wore a sign declaring her origins. Sam's practical wool clothing, weathered by countless seasons, and his quiet, economical way of speaking labeled him just as definitively as a man of the frontier. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house came into view, a 3-story Victorian painted in cheerful yellow with white trim, looking like a flower that had somehow bloomed in the wilderness. Several guests sat on the wide front porch, taking afternoon tea and discussing the mild scandal of Miss Whitmore's extended absence. "Margaret, dear," Mrs. Henderson called out as they approached, her matronly face creased with worry and relief. "We were beginning to fear the worst. Where on earth have you been? If you're finding this content helpful, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support me." The other guests, a traveling salesman, 2 ladies from Denver, and a young couple on their honeymoon, all turned to stare at the unlikely pair. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized how she must appear, her hair disheveled, her dress wrinkled and marked with forest debris, accompanied by a man who looked like he'd stepped from the pages of a frontier novel. "I'm afraid, Miss ... Sam paused, realizing they'd never been properly introduced. "Whitmore," Margaret supplied. "Margaret Whitmore." "Miss Whitmore encountered some difficulty in the forest," Sam continued diplomatically. "I was fortunate to be nearby to assist." Mrs. Henderson's sharp eyes took in Sam's appearance and the protective way he positioned himself near Margaret. "And you are Samuel Cooper?" "Mom, I have a place up in the high country." Recognition flickered in the older woman's eyes. "Ah, the lumberjack. We've heard of you, Mr. Cooper, though you rarely come to town." The traveling salesman, a portly man named Fredericks, stood and adjusted his vest with self-importance. "I say, what sort of difficulty could a lady encounter on a simple nature walk? Surely you're being overly dramatic." Sam's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mountain lion. Young female. Probably hungry." Miss Whitmore was fortunate. A collective gasp arose from the porch gathering. The 2 Denver ladies clutched their pearl necklaces, and the young bride moved closer to her husband. Frederick's pompous expression quickly transformed into one of stunned respect. "Good heavens," Mrs. Henderson breathed. "Margaret, you could have been killed. If not for Mr. Cooper's intervention, I fear I might have been," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying a gravity that silenced any remaining skepticism. As the group absorbed this information, Margaret became acutely aware of the chasm between her world and Sam's. The boarding house guests saw him as an oddity, a rough mountain man whose very presence seemed to make them uncomfortable. They thanked him politely enough for his heroic actions, but their body language suggested they viewed him as belonging to a different species entirely. Sam seemed equally aware of the social dynamics at play. He declined Mrs. Henderson's invitation. 2 tea, touched his hat respectfully to the ladies, and prepared to take his leave. But something in Margaret's expression stopped him. A look that seemed to plead with him not to disappear back into the wilderness just yet. "Mr. Coupeau," she said, stepping forward despite the watching eyes of her fellow guests, "I wonder if you might allow me to thank you properly. Perhaps you'd join me for dinner tomorrow evening. Mrs. Henderson sets an excellent table." The silence that followed was deafening. The social rules of Margaret's world screamed that she was being far too forward. That proper ladies didn't issue dinner invitations to rough mountain men, regardless of the circumstances. But something deeper than propriety drove her words, a recognition that this man had given her more than her life. He'd shown her a different way of being in the world. Sam's brown eyes searched her face, clearly weighing his response. He could see the disapproval radiating from the porch audience, could feel the weight of social expectations pressing down like a physical force. In his world, a man like him didn't sit at tables with ladies like her. "That's very kind, Miss Whitmore," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral, "but I expect you'll want to rest after your ordeal. And I have timber contracts to fulfill." Margaret felt something important slipping away. But before she could respond, Mrs. Henderson surprised everyone by speaking up. "Nonsense. Mr. Cooper, a man who saves one of my guests from a mountain lion, is always welcome at my table. 7 o'clock tomorrow, and I won't hear any arguments." The older woman's declaration carried the authority of someone accustomed to running a boarding house full of travelers with strong opinions. Sam found himself nodding acceptance before he could fully consider the implications. As he took his cliff and disappeared back into the forest trails, Margaret remained on the porch, watching until his broad shoulders vanished among the trees. She was dimly aware of the whispered conversations starting up around her, the shocked tones and speculative glances. But for the first time since leaving Chicago, she felt truly alive, as if the mountain lion had awakened more than just her survival instincts. That evening, as she sat in her room brushing the forest debris from her hair, Margaret found herself replaying every moment of their encounter. Not just the terror of facing the mountain lion, but the quiet confidence in Sam's voice, the gentle way he'd guided her to safety, and the unexpected warmth she'd felt when he touched her arm. Tomorrow's dinner would either mark the beginning of something extraordinary or the polite conclusion of a chance encounter. As Margaret braided her hair for sleep, she realized she'd never wanted anything as much as she wanted to discover which it would be. The following evening arrived with the kind of autumn crispness that made the Colorado mountains feel like God's own cathedral. Margaret had spent an unusual amount of time preparing for dinner, choosing and rejecting 3 different dresses before settling on a simple but elegant emerald green that brought out her eyes. She told herself it was merely proper etiquette to look presentable when thanking her rescuer, but the butterfly dance in her stomach suggested deeper motivations. Sam arrived at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house precisely at 7, having made his own careful preparations. He'd bathed in the cold stream near his cabin, trimmed his beard, and donned his best shirt, a white cotton one that Sarah had sewn for him years ago, and which he'd rarely worn since her death. The walk into town had given him ample time to question the wisdom of accepting this invitation, but something stronger than his habitual caution kept his feet moving forward. Mrs. Henderson greeted him at the door with genuine warmth, ushering him into the cozy dining room, where the other guests were already assembled. The traveling salesman, Fredericks, had apparently spent the day regaling everyone with increasingly dramatic versions of yesterday's rescue, casting Sam as a larger-than-life frontier hero. The 2 Denver ladies, sisters, named Millicent and Prudence Hartwell, regarded him with the fascinated curiosity usually reserved for exotic zoo specimens. Margaret appeared in the doorway, and Sam felt his breath catch. In the soft lamplight, she looked like something from a painting, beautiful and refined, but with a new vitality in her green eyes that hadn't been there yesterday morning. When she smiled at him, something inside his carefully guarded heart shifted like ice breaking up on a spring river. "Mr. Cooper," she said, extending her hand with a grace that spoke of years of proper training. "I'm so glad you could join us." The dinner that followed was unlike anything Sam had experienced in years. Mrs. Henderson had outdone herself with roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from her garden, and biscuits that melted like butter on the tongue. The conversation flowed around the table like a gentle stream, covering topics from the upcoming winter weather to the latest fashions from Denver to the challenges of frontier life. Sam found himself drawn into discussions he hadn't realized he'd missed. His years of solitude had made him forget the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with other people, of hearing different perspectives and experiences. Fredericks, despite his earlier pomposity, proved to have interesting stories about his travels throughout the territory. The Hartwell sisters were more worldly than their prim appearances suggested, having come west to invest in mining properties. But it was Margaret who held Sam's attention. She asked thoughtful questions about his life in the mountains, genuinely curious about how he'd learned to read the forest's signs and survive independently. Her interest wasn't the casual politeness of social obligation, but the engaged fascination of someone hungry for authentic experience. "I confess, Mr. Cooper," she said during a lull in the general conversation, "yesterday was the first time I'd ever seen wilderness that wasn't manicured and safe. In Chicago, even our parks are carefully controlled. What you showed me, the real forest, with all its beauty and danger, it was like seeing the world with new eyes." Sam set down his coffee cup, studying her face in the warm lamplight. "Most folks find the wilderness uncomfortable, too unpredictable for civilized sensibilities. Perhaps that's exactly what some of us need," Margaret replied quietly. "A little unpredictability. A reminder that there's more to life than drawing rooms and calling cards." The comment drew curious glances from the other guests, but Margaret seemed oblivious to their attention. Something in her tone suggested depths of dissatisfaction that surprised Sam. This elegant city lady carried her own wounds, her own reasons for seeking refuge in the Colorado mountains. After dinner, Margaret suggested a walk on the front porch to enjoy the evening air. The other guests retired to the parlor for cards and gossip, leaving them alone under a canopy of stars that blazed with an intensity impossible to imagine in the city. "It's so quiet here," Margaret observed, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders against the mountain chill. "In Chicago, there's always noise, carriages, factories, people shouting. I never realized how much I craved silence until I found it." Sam leaned against the porch railing, comfortable with the quiet in a way that spoke of years spent in solitude. "Silence teaches you things that noise drowns out, like how to listen to what matters." They stood together in companionable stillness, watching the lights of the small town twinkle below and breathing air so clean it seemed to wash their lungs. Margaret found herself studying Sam's profile in the starlight, noting the strength in his jaw and the way his eyes seemed to hold depths of experience she could only imagine. "May I ask, what brought you to the mountains, Mr. Cooper?" she ventured. "You seemed like a man with a story." Sam was quiet for so long that Margaret began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful tone of someone unaccustomed to sharing personal pain. "My wife died 3 years ago. Consumption. We'd built a life together in these mountains. And after she passed, I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The city folk have their society and their distractions. But up here," he gestured toward the dark peaks looming against the starry sky. "Up here, grief has room to breathe. And eventually, if you're lucky, it transforms into something else." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the quiet anguish in his words. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm gently. "I'm so sorry for your loss. She must have been very special." "She was." Sam's voice softened with memory. "Sarah could find joy in the smallest things: a perfect sunrise, fresh bread from the oven, the sound of rain on our cabin roof. She taught me that happiness isn't about having everything you want, but about appreciating what you have." "That's a beautiful way to remember her," Margaret said softly. Then, surprising herself with her boldness, she added, "I came here running from a broken engagement. My fiancé chose his social standing over our love when my father's business failed. I thought my heart was completely broken. But now, I wonder if what I lost wasn't really love at all, but just the idea of love." Sam turned to face her fully, seeing in her candid admission a courage that matched what she'd shown facing the mountain lion. Sometimes what feels like an ending is really a beginning in disguise. Their eyes met and held, and in that moment, both felt the shift of something fundamental. Not love, it was too soon for that, but the recognition of kindred spirits who had found each other at exactly the right moment in their healing journeys. "Miss Whitmore," Sam said, his voice unusually formal despite the intimacy of their conversation, "I wonder if you might like to see more of the wilderness. Safely, of course. I could show you some of the places Sarah and I discovered together, places where the beauty might help with that healing you're seeking." Margaret's smile was radiant. In the starlight, "I would like that very much, Mr. Cooper, more than I can properly express." As they made plans for future meetings and shared adventures, neither could have predicted how dramatically their lives were about to change. What had begun as a chance rescue was blossoming into something neither had dared hope for a second. Chance at happiness built on mutual respect, shared pain, and the promise of healing together. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment down below. I love hearing your thoughts and answering questions. What was your favorite part? Leave your comment below and let's chat about it. If you're not subscribed yet, take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the most beautiful big